Call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Chair, I'd like to congratulate the member for bringing this issue to the attention of the House and the Australian Cord Blood Collection Network's fine work that's been done over the last 10 years. I'd also like to thank the member for introducing the acronym HSC so that I don't have to wrangle with the almost impossible to pronounce word hemopoietic. All of the diseases that have been shown since the early 80s to respond to cord blood have seen significant improvements in survival ratios over the last 2 decades. I can recall during my training in 1988 when cord blood was first used in a transplant. By 1990 things had moved very fast and there was already then a very good understanding of human lymphocyte antigen markers on the outside of cell walls, which basically determine whether cells are recognised as foreign or not when they're transferred or transplanted between hosts. That applies to cord blood as it does to every other organ, and I'd like to give just a couple of comments on cord blood before moving to the more general issues of transplantation. Cord blood banks, of course, were set up, I think, as early as 1992, and Eurocord was the first of those a few years later. By 1995, of course, it was quite common in Europe to have access to those kinds of procedures. And Australia leads the way outside of Europe in general, with I think around about 168 procedures last year, which makes us probably third or fourth outside of Europe, but still a long way behind nations like France and Spain that lead the world. Of course, what needs to be remembered with these stem cells are they're not quite the same as an embryonic stem cell in that they've been through already one series of differentiation, so they're not quite as plastic as one would hope, but there is some positive news that there may be some use for them to be used as stem cells in that truly plastic sense that they can actually differentiate into different tissues. But the main focus is, of course, on the treatment of aplastic anemias and the family of anemias, and, of course, a whole range of blood-borne cancers for which the key treatment is systemic chemotherapy, followed by a bone marrow transplant. That's what cord blood's all about. Now, the key issue at the moment around cord blood is not so much HLA antigen compatibility, which is always really important, but we're now realising it's actually the volume of blood and the amount of packed cell that's actually collected. There's very little point in collecting less than 60 mils, and what we're finding now is that we're pushing higher and higher in Australia to 60, 80 and ultimately 100 mil minimum collections to be a useful sample for use in therapeutics. So what we're now discovering worldwide in the most recent research is it's not so much HLA compatibility as it is the amount of blood that can be collected from a placenta. And as has already been pointed out by the previous speaker, we're avoiding a lot of the ethical and moral issues around the destruction of an embryo, but on the same token, apart from some fairly unusual peri-Mediterranean traditions around the placenta is normally discarded in Australia, so it makes the collection of the blood from a placental cord almost without concern, apart from the fact that you need skilled people to do it. And if you're not able to collect 80 or 90 or 100 mils of cord blood, there is a real problem because much of our collection consists of samples less than 80 mils, and that's very problematic in therapeutics. What we're also seeing, if you draw a bit of a bell curve of the volumes of blood that is being collected, we're seeing a real depletion at the high end of the large collections. There's a real chunk coming out because they're being deployed clinically and where there's a real gap of these large volume collections. So another very good reason for supporting the previous speaker who talks about having specialised staff able to collect these bloods in adequate volumes all around the country in as many hours of the day as is obviously clinically and financially feasible. There's been a tenfold collection of cord bloods over the last 10 years, and that matches what's happening overseas. And we also know that there's increased storage, there's more rapid availability, and all of these elements are really important in being able to treat people that need it as well. The benefits of cord blood, of course, are that they're a fairly immature cell. We call them immunogenically naive, and that makes them far more able to be used more broadly. They have a good gene transfection rate, longer telomeres, and a higher expansion potential as well, which is always good if you're trying to maximise your clinical results. Of course, for the banks themselves, what we do need is an ability to store them for years but use them immediately, and that's why nothing else is going to work, and that was why it was recognised as early as 2000 that we needed a well-funded cord blood collection network to support the work of the banks, which had been around but haven't really grown to a point where there was enough samples to remove concerns around HLA matching. The problem is if you move to an Indigenous network or Indigenous mums that have completely different HLAs, it's even harder to find a useful match. And that's why it's a real challenge to move into some of the minority populations and expand the bank accordingly. Just moving more broadly to organ and tissue work in encouraging people to be donors around the country. That's a very important work of both governments as well. Australia, even though we almost universally accept the importance of organ donation and the fact that it saves lives, we're still very, very low in the numbers. And my general rule is 20, 40, 60, which is only 20% of Australians can actually recall an explicit conversation with family members about whether to become organ donors or not. Around 40% of people simply do not know, and only 58 to 60% of people actually agree to it at the time when that very, very tough decision has to be made to allow a loved one to donate their precious organs. What we do know is that if Australians do take that step, then of course our rates are exceptionally good, both of the number of organs that are harvested. At the moment we have around 13 per million Australians in the population have been organ donors. But once that decision is made, a large number of organs can be harvested and deployed in a clinically appropriate way within the time frame, and that speaks to how well our system is operating. There's 1,700 people sitting on waiting lists for organs right now. Less than half of them successfully receive a clinical operation in each year. And of course, around 450 people are required to provide 800 people with a life-changing organ transplant. Right now, we know that there's up to 4,000 skin and tissue transplants, around 1,100 corneal transplants, which can help around 1,600 people for the obvious reasons. And I can tell you that when that very, very tough decision has to be made, where one has to talk to families about donating corneas, it's an intensely personal and very, very, very difficult conversation to have with a family at a most difficult time. But of course, being able to obtain those corneas within a 6 or 12-hour time period and to actually transport those in maintaining the cold chain and having them delivered to where they're needed and have the entire surgical team ready to put those corneas in is no mean feat. But what we know is that particularly around the larger centres in the Australian, obviously the major centres, that's actually working exceptionally well. So we're now seeing around 1,600 people with their sight restored thanks to corneal transplants. Just worth noting that there's a bit of variation between states. Gold star to South Australia for 38 donors per million, and bringing up the rear, Western Australia. I'm glad to see there's no Western Australians in the chamber at the moment to take that message back to their state government. With 8 donors per million, they really can do better. Each of these figures do improve slightly each year, and that's very much due to the strong work that's been done by federal governments to encourage organ donation. Particularly, the previous Prime Minister made a particular focus of that during his tenure, and that was much appreciated. So to close with where we began with cord blood, there is one thing that we know. Collection of cord blood should be something that occurs at every location where there is an obstetric service, and that should be the goal. We can train existing clinical staff to become specialised at collecting cord blood to maximise the odds that if a mum decides to donate cord blood that she's able to. And finally, we need to make sure that that cord blood is available in a large enough sample to make it a clinically useful one. And we do face this challenge that there is a real deficiency of high volume samples because they're actually being utilised, and it means that we do have a library now that is skewing back towards having the smaller samples that are becoming less and less clinically useful. We support the motion.